At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. Captain Solaro stared at the portable radiation detector in his hand, nearly dropping it when it confirmed the dire truth. Just like the previous two devices, this one was also beeping, warning that radiation was leaking and the containment field was failing. If this went on, the main reactor would explode in minutes. His grip tightened around the device, knuckles pale beneath his transparent skin. Through the semi-translucent flesh of his neck, where his uniform's high collar failed to reach, his inner organs glowed a vivid, shameful red, the same crimson glow emanating from the detector's warning display. For Sibir, especially one who had earned his captain's stripes through 2 decades of distinguished service, this color was absolutely forbidden. Red meant panic. Red meant loss of control. Red meant weakness that no officer of the Galactic Council's exploration fleet should ever display, particularly not in front of his crew. But how could he maintain composure? How could anyone maintain composure when the main reactor, the beating heart of their ship, was about to explode while they drifted in the deepest reaches of uncharted space? A sudden movement jolted Solaro from his paralysis. Ziff, the ship's navigator, snatched the detector from his hand with a swift motion that would have been profoundly disrespectful under any normal circumstances. The reptilian's green scales went pale as he brought the device close to his face, his vertical pupils contracting as he studied the readouts. "We are all going to die, aren't we?" Ziff's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were simply confirming their next destination coordinates rather than announcing their imminent demise. The question hung in the recycled air of the reactor control room like a death sentence waiting to be signed. Solaro turned very slowly, as if moving through thick liquid, to regard the other crew member present. Only 3 of them stood in this cramped space that smelled of ozone and fear: himself, Ziff, and Tillip, the chief engineer. Tillip cut an unusual figure even among the diverse species of the Galactic Council. The gray-skinned engineer's natural build was so weak, so fragile, that he wore his exoskeleton at all times, a skeletal framework of metal and synthetic muscle that enclosed his body like a second skin, allowing him to function in normal gravity. Solaro's organs shifted to a deeper red, and he forced himself to take a breath. "Tillip," he said, proud that his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Is there something you can do?" The chief engineer didn't respond immediately. His large, dark eyes remained fixed on the main screen before them, where dozens of readouts painted a picture of cascading system failures. The heat readings alone would have been cause for concern. The radiation levels were beyond alarming. Together, they spelled certain death. "Captain," Tillip said finally, his voice emerging thin and reedy from his slight frame, "you already know the answer to that question." And Solaro did. Of course he did. He'd known it from the moment the first detector had started screaming its warnings. But some part of him, the part that had survived 3 hostile first contacts and a near collision with a rogue asteroid field, had hoped that maybe there was a solution his non-engineer's mind simply couldn't see. The silence stretched. Solaro found himself staring at the main screen, watching the visual representation of the reactor core glow with warning indicators. Red alerts, orange cautions, yellow advisories. So many that they overlapped, creating a kaleidoscope of impending doom that he couldn't fully parse even if he'd had years to study it. The core itself glowed in the center of the display, a malevolent star getting ready to go supernova and take them all with it. His thoughts spiraled as he stared. The escape pods, useless. Even if they could evacuate the entire crew in time, which they couldn't, where would they go? They were in deep space, in an uncharted corner of the galaxy that no ship from the Galactic Council had ever explored before. That's why they'd come here in the first place. That's why this was supposed to be the most successful expedition in Council history. And they'd succeeded, hadn't they? Just 3 standard days ago, they'd discovered it, an artifact from one of the lost civilizations, the ancient ones who had seeded the galaxy with technology millennia before any of the current Council species had even achieved spaceflight. The artifact alone would be worth more credits than Solaro had seen in his entire career. Every member of the crew would make enough from their shares to retire early, to live comfortably for the rest of their natural lives. Or they would have, if the reactor hadn't decided to kill them all in the middle of nowhere. Solaro's organs shifted again, the red fading to a melancholic purple. Acceptance, the color of dignified surrender that, at least, was appropriate for a Sibir captain. If they were going to die, they would do so with grace.
"It was great," he said quietly, "being in the same crew as you both. All these years together. I couldn't have asked for better officers."
He saw Ziff's reptilian eyes soften, the nictitating membranes sliding across them in what Solaro had learned was a sign of deep emotion in his species. Tillip's exoskeleton seemed to sag slightly, the machinery compensating for a moment of weakness in its wearer. There was warmth in their expressions, and that same purple melancholy that Solaro felt coursing through his own veins. They had accepted their doom. But suddenly, the door to the reactor control room hissed open. All three of them turned as one, startled by the intrusion. The figure that stumbled through the doorway was unlike any of them, bipedal like Solaro, but built more solidly, with a shock of dark hair and skin that was opaque, keeping whatever organs lay beneath mercifully hidden. The human technician stopped dead when he saw the screen, his eyes widening. The toolbox he'd been carrying slipped from his fingers and hit the deck. The cigarette that had been dangling from his lips, a habit that Solaro had tried to discourage but had eventually given up on, tumbled to the floor, scattering sparks. "She," the human said. Right, Solaro had forgotten. When the crisis had begun, he'd issued a ship-wide summons for anyone with even passing knowledge of the reactor systems to report to the control room. The human, Miller was it, or Michael, had been hired just before this expedition, a last-minute addition when their previous technician had fallen ill. This was his first mission with the crew. "I'm sorry," Solaro said, and he was surprised to find he genuinely meant it. The human seemed like a decent enough fellow, even if he did have some odd habits. "I called for everyone who might be able to help, but I don't think there's anything you can do here." The human didn't respond. His gaze was transfixed on the screen, locked onto the failing reactor core display with an intensity that reminded Solaro of how Tillip had stared at it earlier, just before accepting the inevitable. But wait, there was something different in the human's expression. Tillip had looked at the screen with the numb recognition of an expert who knew exactly how bad things were. The human was looking at it like he was solving a puzzle. Like he was seeing something the rest of them had missed. The human cracked his knuckles, a grotesque sound that made Ziff flinch, and said with absolute certainty, "I'm going in." Before any of them could process what he meant, the human was moving. He crossed the control room in 3 long strides, grabbed the edge of an access panel and wrenched it open. Behind the panel was a narrow maintenance vent, barely wide enough for a child to crawl through, let alone a fully grown adult of any species. "Wait!" Solaro finally found his voice as the implications caught up with his shock. He rushed forward, reaching the human just as the technician was preparing to haul himself into the impossibly small opening. "You can't! That leads directly to the containment field. The radiation levels—" The human's hand shot out and shoved Solaro's reaching grasp away, not gently. "I know where it leads," the human said, and then he was gone, pulling himself into the vent with no fear whatsoever. Solaro caught a last glimpse of the soles of his boots before they disappeared into the darkness, and then there was nothing but the echo of the human scrambling through the maintenance shaft, the sound growing fainter as he crawled deeper into the bowels of the ship, toward the reactor, toward certain death. "Is he?" Ziff started. "Insane?" Tillip finished. "Apparently." Solaro stood frozen, staring at the open access panel. His organs flickered through a confusion of colors, red panic, orange confusion, yellow concern, before settling on a muddy brown he couldn't even properly identify. What had just happened? What was the human thinking?
Captain,
Ziff's voice was uncertain.
should we go after him? And do what?
Tillip asked, his exoskeleton whirring as he gestured at the vent.
None of us would fit through there, and even if we could, we'd be dead from radiation exposure before we got halfway to the core. So would he,
Ziff protested, his tail lashing in agitation.
That's the point. Why would he? Why would anyone?
I don't know, Solaro admitted. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Humans were relatively new to the Galactic Council, their homeworld having achieved faster-than-light travel only a few decades ago. Maybe they were one of those species unable to accept defeat, who kept struggling foolishly against certain death even when any rational being would simply make their peace with the inevitable. How tragic to spend one's final moments crawling through a cramped tunnel toward a futile end, rather than facing death with dignity among one's crewmates. He was about to voice this thought when something on the screen changed. A warning indicator blinked out. Then another. Then a dozen more, vanishing like stars being swallowed by a sudden darkness.
What?
Tillip lurched forward, his exoskeleton carrying him to the main console.
That's not possible. The cascade failure should be irreversible by now. Even if someone manually disabled the safeties and vented all the excess heat directly into space, which would kill them instantly, it wouldn't account for.
Another wave of warnings disappeared. The heat readings began to stabilize. The radiation levels started to drop. Solaro stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing.
Is this a malfunction? A system error?
The radiation detectors,
Ziff said, his voice hollow. He held up the portable unit he'd taken from Solaro earlier. The red warning light had gone dark. The constant beeping had ceased.
They've stopped. All of them.
Tillip pulled out his own detector, the one that had been clipped to his exoskeleton. Silent. He checked another mounted on the wall. Silent. A fourth from the emergency supply cabinet. Silent. The only sounds in the reactor control room were their breathing and the thunder of their hearts. Solaro could see his own pulse racing through the translucent vessels in his arms, a blue glow that at least wasn't that shameful red anymore. He looked at Ziff. The reptilian navigator's eyes were wide, his pupils dilated to full circles. He looked at Tillip. The chief engineer's face was slack in disbelief, his usual professional composure completely shattered. Solaro knew his own expression probably mirrored theirs. Disbelief. Refusal to allow hope. Because hope, after accepting death so completely, was perhaps the cruelest thing of all. The silence stretched on. On the screen, the reactor core's display had shifted from that malevolent pulsing red to a stable, calm green. All systems nominal. Temperature within acceptable parameters. Radiation levels at background normal. It was as if the crisis had never happened, except for the fading terror still coursing through Solaro's veins. A scraping sound echoed from the vent. All three of them turned to watch as, slowly, the human emerged from the access panel. He looked tired. His face was flushed, and dark patches of sweat stained his uniform. But he'd only been gone for perhaps 10 minutes, 15 at most. How could someone look so exhausted after such a short time? The human pulled himself fully out of the vent, landed on his feet with surprising grace, and then turned to face them. He was smiling, actually smiling, as if he hadn't just crawled through a radiation-soaked death trap. "Lucky me," the human said, dusting off his uniform with casual swipes of his hands. "There's a cure for radiation poisoning." Solaro opened his mouth, then closed it. Opened it again. No words came out. The human bent down to retrieve his fallen toolbox, checked its contents, and nodded to himself in satisfaction. "Worth it," he added, almost as an afterthought, "when the alternative is blowing up in the void with the ship." Solaro and the others spoke at the same time, their voices overlapping and contradicting one another as Solaro, Ziff, and Tillip all tried to ask their questions at once, each offering their own theory about how the human had saved the ship. The human held up a hand, and remarkably, they all fell silent. There was something in his expression now, something serious that made Solaro's organs clench with a new kind of anxiety.
Unfortunately, the human said, you're all wrong about what happened here.
He reached into one of the pockets of his uniform and pulled out a small device no larger than his palm. It was a tangle of colored wires, red, blue, green, yellow, wrapped around what looked like a crude circuit board. Some of the wires had been cut, their exposed ends visible.
It was sabotage, the human said flatly. Someone tried to blow up this ship with everyone inside.
The words hit Solaro like a knife to the heart.
No, he said automatically. Everyone on this crew, everyone except you, has been working with me for years, some of them for over a decade. I know these people. I trust these people.
We're family,
Ziff added, his voice firm despite the way his tail had started lashing again.
None of us would.
The only person I might actually suspect,
Solaro continued, and he hated himself even as the words left his mouth,
would be you, the new hire, the outsider. But that doesn't make sense either, because you just saved us all.
Saved us all. The words felt good in his mouth, warm and bright despite the dark suspicion he was voicing. They weren't going to die. None of them were going to die, because this human, this stranger, had crawled into hell and pulled them all back from the brink.
I agree,
Tillip said quietly.
I've worked alongside everyone on this ship, shared meals with them, celebrated holidays from a dozen different worlds with them. I can't believe any of them would want to kill the rest of us. But why?
Ziff demanded, looking from Tillip to Solaro to the human.
Even if someone was enough of a monster to try this, why would they sabotage the ship only to die with us here in the middle of nowhere? It doesn't make any sense.
The human touched his chin, his eyes distant as he thought. The gesture reminded Solaro of some of the tactical officers he'd served with, the ones who could see patterns in chaos.
Unless, the human said slowly, someone took advantage of the warnings the reactor caused and launched the shuttle.
Ice flooded Solaro's veins. The shuttle. The exploration shuttle they'd used to recover the artifact. It was small enough to hold only 1 or 2 people, but it had its own faster-than-light drive, its own life support, its own... His eyes widened, his organs flashing through a rapid sequence of colors he couldn't control. He spun toward the door, already moving, already giving orders before his conscious mind had fully caught up.
To the bridge with me, he roared. Right now!
They moved as one, the 4 of them, their footsteps echoing through the corridors of the ship. Solaro set a punishing pace, his long Sibir legs eating up the distance in ground-covering strides. Behind him, he could hear Ziff's clawed feet clicking against the deck plating, the whir of Tillip's exoskeleton, and the human's heavier footfalls. The corridors of the ship were familiar territory, paths Solaro could have walked blindfolded after years of service. They passed through the crew quarters section, where several doors opened and crew members poked their heads out, their faces showing relief at seeing their captain alive and apparently no longer in immediate danger.
Captain!
A young Sibir engineering assistant, Solaro couldn't remember her name, stepped into the corridor.
Is the reactor?
Solaro pushed past her without breaking stride, not trusting himself to speak. The anger building in his chest was too hot, too overwhelming. If what the human suspected was true, if someone had actually tried to murder the entire crew...
Sir!
Another voice, this one belonging to Kreeth, one of the medical staff.
We felt the ship shake, and the radiation alarms!
Solaro didn't even acknowledge him, shouldering past with enough force to send the smaller being stumbling backward. He'd feel bad about his behavior later. Right now, all that mattered was reaching the bridge and confirming the terrible suspicion taking root in his mind. They turned a corner, climbed a ladder shaft. Tillip's exoskeleton had a harder time with this, but he managed and emerged into the command deck corridor. The bridge doors loomed ahead, sealed and dark. Solaro had ordered a full lockdown when the reactor crisis began, telling everyone to remain in their quarters until the all-clear was given. Standard procedure for an emergency that might require evacuation. The perfect cover for someone to slip away unnoticed. Solaro's hands trembled as he entered his command override code. The doors opened, revealing the bridge beyond. Empty. Silent. The various stations sat unmanned, their displays cycling through routine status updates, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded in the heart of the ship. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of blue and shadow, making the familiar space seem alien and threatening. Solaro moved to the captain's chair, but didn't sit. Instead, he leaned over the armrest console as he pulled up the ship's logs. Behind him, he heard Ziff take his position at the navigation station, Tillip at engineering and communications, and the human, after a moment's hesitation, moving to the weapons console. Good. The human seems to understand the gravity of the situation without needing detailed instructions.
Sealing the bridge,
Tillip announced. The doors hissed shut behind them, and Solaro heard the heavy clunk of the magnetic locks engaging. Until they sorted this out, no one else could be trusted. As much as it pained him to think it, anyone on his crew could be a potential saboteur. Anyone except these three who had been with him in the reactor control room when it all went wrong. Solaro's eyes scanned through the logs, his heart sinking further with each passing second. Launch sequences, airlock cycling, shuttle bay depressurization. All automated, all routine, all perfectly normal, except for the timestamp.
There,
he said. He highlighted the entry and threw it onto the main view screen for all of them to see. The exploration shuttle had launched 12 minutes ago, right in the middle of the reactor crisis. Possibly at the exact moment the human had been fixing the core, when everyone else on the ship would have been too terrified or too focused on potential evacuation procedures to notice one small craft slipping away into the darkness.
"Those thrice damned!"
Solaro started cursing in his native Sabir, then switched to Galactic Standard, then to the guttural trader's cant he'd picked up during his years in the merchant fleet, mixing all three languages into a stream of invective that would have made his instructors at the academy faint. He cursed the saboteurs' ancestors, their descendants, and every star in their home system. He cursed their molecular structure and the very atoms that made up their being.
Captain!
Tillip's voice cut through his rage, cool and professional.
The shuttle can't have gone far. Not in 12 minutes. Not even at its maximum speed.
Solaro took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. Right. They still had a chance. The main ship was faster than the shuttle, more maneuverable, better armed. They could catch up. They could stop this.
"Agreed,"
he said, his voice steadier now. He turned to face his makeshift bridge crew, these three beings he now trusted more than anyone else in the galaxy.
"I hope you can handle the weapons station,"
he said directly to the human.
"Until we solve this, no one besides the four of us can be trusted."
The human nodded grimly. "I'll manage."
"Ziff, I need a tracking solution. Where are they?"
The navigator's claws were interacting with his console.
Scanning now, Captain. Looking for engine signatures, hull resonance, anything that... Got them!
His vertical pupils contracted as he focused on his displays.
They're on the main viewer, bearing 275, Mark 18.
Solaro looked at the main screen as the image shifted, showing a field of stars and, barely visible against the black, the tiny shape of the exploration shuttle. It was running with minimal power, probably trying to stay hidden until it could get far enough away to risk a faster-than-light jump. Too bad for them that Solaro had no intention of letting them get that far. His hands moved across his console, pulling up the navigation controls. He could have handed this off to Ziff, but some part of him needed to do this personally, needed to be the one to bring the traitor to justice. The calculations took only seconds, a short jump, a micro-hop really, of the kind that was technically not recommended by any of the manuals, but which every experienced pilot knew how to perform. Close the distance, appear right on top of them, give them no chance to run. "Brace," Solaro said, and engaged the faster-than-light drive. The universe twisted. It lasted only a heartbeat, but that single moment of transit felt like being turned inside out, having every molecule in your body scattered across light years and then reassembled in a new location. Solaro's organs flashed through a rainbow of colors, and he heard Ziff make a choking sound behind him. Then they were back in normal space, and the exploration shuttle filled the view screen, so close that Solaro could make out individual hull plates.
Report!
He managed, his voice slightly strained from the brutal jump.
I'm going to be sick.
Ziff groaned, but his hands remained steady on his console.
Scanning the shuttle for weapons. Stand by. Scan complete. No weapons detected. They're a sitting duck.
Good.
Solaro's smile was not pleasant. He activated the communications console himself, not wanting to wait for Tillip to route it to him.
Connect me to that shuttle. Now!
Channel open, Captain!
Tillip confirmed. Moments passed. Solaro could imagine the panic aboard the small craft as they realized they'd been caught, as they saw the much larger ship materialize from faster-than-light right on top of them. He could imagine their desperation, their fear. Good. Let them feel a fraction of what they'd tried to inflict on the rest of the crew. The communication channel remained silent except for the faint hiss of static and the sound of panicked breathing. They knew they were caught. They knew they were dead if Solaro decided to blow them out of space, and they were too afraid or too ashamed to show their face or speak. Fine. Solaro would give them something to think about. He gestured to the communications console, transferring control to route the ship's internal cameras to the channel. Specifically, the camera focused on the weapons station, on the human sitting there with his hands resting near the controls, looking every bit as dangerous as he'd looked confident when he'd gone into that reactor. Solaro leaned into the microphone, his voice cold.
This is Captain Solaro. I'm going to make this very simple for you. You have 30 seconds to shut down your engines and surrender. If you don't, I'm going to order the human at my weapons station to press every single button in front of him, and we're all going to see what happens to your little shuttle.
On cue, the human made an elaborate show of examining the weapons console, his fingers hovering over various controls as if trying to decide which one to try first. He even cracked his knuckles again, that disturbing sound carrying clearly over the open channel. More heavy breathing from the other end. Solaro could almost hear the wheels turning in the traitor's head, weighing their options. Try to run? Impossible. The main ship was faster. Try to fight? Laughable. The shuttle had no weapons. Try to call Solaro's bluff? Would he really order an attack? Would the human really fire? The answer was that Solaro honestly didn't know what he'd do if they refused. He'd never had to order someone killed before, never had to make that kind of decision. But looking at the three beings around him, beings who had faced death together and come through the other side, he thought he might be capable of it if pushed. Apparently, the saboteur thought so too.
Don't shoot!
A voice finally crackled over the comm, defeated and small.
I'm shutting down the engines. I surrender.
On the view screen, Solaro watched the shuttle's engine glow fade. The small craft went dark and still, a dead thing floating in the void.
Ziff, tractor beam. Bring them into the docking bay,
Solaro ordered.
Tillip, I want a security team. No, scratch that. I'll go down there myself. You three, maintain the bridge. No one else comes in until I get back.
Captain?
Tillip said hesitantly.
Are you sure you should?
I need to see who did this,
Solaro interrupted, his voice harder than he'd intended.
I need to look them in the eye and understand why.
The trip to the docking bay seemed to take hours, though it was probably no more than 5 minutes. Solaro's mind raced the entire way, running through his crew roster, trying to guess who it might be. Who could have betrayed them all so completely? Who would have been cold-blooded enough to try to kill nearly 50 innocent beings? The docking bay doors opened. Inside, the exploration shuttle sat in its cradle, held in place by the tractor beam. It looked so small, so harmless, hard to believe it represented such evil. Solaro had brought a portable restraint field generator and a sidearm, though he hoped he wouldn't need either. He approached the shuttle's airlock, entered his override code, and watched as the hatch cycled open. The figure that emerged made Solaro's organs flash through several colors before settling on a deep, dark purple. Mourning purple. Betrayal purple. Zareth, the sensors officer. One of Ziff's own species, a green-scaled reptilian who had served on the crew for nearly 8 years. Solaro had been at Zarif's daughter's naming ceremony, had shared drinks with him after successful missions, had trusted him at his station, day after day, monitoring the space around them for threats. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Zarif wouldn't meet his eyes. The reptilian's tail dragged on the deck, his shoulders slumped in defeat.
The artifact,
He said quietly.
I already sold it. Made the deal before we even left dock. Just had to get it to the buyer.
You sold it.
Solaro's voice was flat, emotionless.
You sold our discovery. The thing we all worked together to find. The thing that was going to set us all up for life.
I needed the credits now.
Zarif said, a desperate edge in his voice.
I lost a considerable sum in a gamble with someone who means business. If I don't pay them...
So you decided to kill the rest of us?
Solaro's shout echoed off the docking bay walls.
They wouldn't have died!
Zarif protested, but his voice cracked.
I set the sabotage to trigger after I launched. You'd have time to evacuate the escape pods.
The escape pods would have been useless.
Solaro was right in Zarif's face now, his organs blazing red with fury.
We're in uncharted space. Do you understand what that means? Even if we'd all made it to the pods, we'd have drifted for years before anyone found us. Most species would have died long before rescue arrived. And you knew that. You had to have known that.
Zarif said nothing. There was nothing he could say. Solaro activated the restraint field, watching as the shimmering energy barrier enclosed the traitor. He'd let the authorities decide the formal punishment. Right now, he just wanted this being out of his sight. Later, hours later, after the crew had been informed, after Zarif had been secured in his cell, after Solaro had filed his official report with the Galactic Council, the captain found himself back in his quarters, staring at the wall and trying to process everything that had happened. A soft chime at his door announced a visitor.
Enter,
he called. Ziff, Tillip, and the human filed in. They looked as exhausted as Solaro felt.
We took a vote,
Ziff said without preamble.
Everyone agreed. Zarif's share of the artifact reward goes to the human, on top of his regular portion.
Solaro blinked, surprised by the swiftness of the decision.
That's generous, but shouldn't we?
He saved our lives,
Tillip interrupted, his exoskeleton whirring softly.
all of us, and he caught the traitor. Without him, we'd all be dead or drifting in escape pods, hoping for a rescue that would never come. One extra share isn't enough, but it's what we can offer.
The human looked uncomfortable with the attention, shifting his weight from foot to foot.
I was just doing my job,
he muttered.
Your job,
Solaro said,
is listed as maintenance technician. Nothing in that job says crawl through a radioactive death trap to manually fix a sabotaged reactor core.
It is now, the human said with a slight smile. Despite everything, Solaro found himself smiling back.
Then I suppose we should make it official. Welcome to the permanent crew. I'm sorry I've been so caught up in everything. I realize I never properly learned your name.
Michael, the human said. Michael Gray.
Well, Michael.
Solaro extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting that he'd studied before hiring human crew.
Welcome aboard. Properly this time.
Michael shook his hand, and Solaro felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his organs' color-changing properties. This was rightness. This was belonging. In the weeks and months that followed, as they made their way back to Council space and processed the artifact deals, minus Zarif's betrayal, the crew found themselves growing closer. The near-death experience had bonded them in ways that years of routine missions never could. Michael became something of a legend among the crew, the human who had saved them all, the one who had looked at certain death and decided to crack his knuckles and go to work. Stories were told about him in the mess hall, each retelling adding a bit more drama, a bit more heroism. And when the reward finally came through, even split among the remaining crew, it was more than any of them had dreamed. Every single member confirmed they wanted Michael to receive double shares. Michael tried to refuse, of course, but Solaro put his foot down in his capacity as captain, making it an order.
"You gave us back our lives," he said. "You gave us our futures. This is the least we can do."
Years later, long after that expedition had ended and they'd all gone their separate ways, some to early retirements as planned, others to new adventures among the stars, Solaro would look back on that day in the reactor control room as the moment that changed his life. Not just because they'd survived, not just because they'd caught a traitor, but because they'd gained something more valuable than any ancient artifact. They'd gained a friend, a brother, a human who, when everyone else had accepted death, had cracked his knuckles and gone in. And in the years that followed, whenever Solaro found himself facing an impossible situation, he'd remember Michael crawling into that radioactive hell without hesitation. Some species called it stubbornness, some called it courage, some called it madness. Solaro just called it humanity.